Rod said that me and Eric are proof positive about how programmable or how trainable Baxter is. I got to correct the record a little bit. We went on a visit to the factory in Boston, and we were getting shown around, and Rod and his CEO were showing us Baxter. We were meeting him for the first time, and then they had to take a call from Todd Friedman or somebody like that, so they ran away, and Eric and I were left alone with Baxter for a couple minutes. We said, all right, let's see what happens here. So we grabbed it by the wrist, and there was a rubber ducky or something nearby. And sure enough, we brought it over. We said, grab that, and it did. And it picked it up, and we're like, all right, this is fantastic. This is working exactly as advertised. And then Baxter did nothing. And we're like, oh crap, it didn't take long to discover the bug in that software, did it? Why is this hanging here? And Rod eventually came back and he said, what are you guys doing? I said, come on, you told us this was trainable by anybody in 5 minutes. We're trying to put that to the test. And Rod said, great. You guys are programming a pick and place operation. You've done the pick. Have you specified the place yet? And we said, hey, no, not really. And he said, okay, Baxter's not hung up. You're just morons. You haven't been able to train this robot correctly. And Eric and I looked at each other, and we realized that between the two of us, we have 8 degrees from Harvard and MIT. And that's probably part of the problem instead of part of the solution. We were overthinking this thing like crazy, whereas the right thing to do is say, okay, pick this up over here and take it over here. Rod has assured us that people who are not overthinking the problem terribly can actually do that and get useful work out of the robot. I am the last thing standing between us and cocktail hour, so I understand everything that implies. This is going to go quite quickly. But we certainly can't have a talk about MIT and the digital economy without bringing up the big data meme. Eric and I wrote an article that appeared in HBR last fall called Big Data, the Management Revolution. And I think what HBR does is just take topic of the day and put : the management revolution after it, and they run that article about every 18 months, so we were part of the latest cycle with that. But unfortunately, it's a terrible title for an article, but it's an accurate one. We do believe that there is horribly overused word, a revolution coming to the art and science of leading and managing enterprises because of big data. And in our last session today, I just want to try to make the case for that a little bit. The first question we get asked whenever we talk about this with management teams, when we try to cross the suit-geek boundary and talk to the suits about what the geek world is doing, we hear 2 questions over and over. We hear, the first one is, how much data are we talking about? What do you mean here? And I want to walk you through the most entertaining answer to that question that I've come across. How much data are we talking about here? Well, in about 1980, there was a company founded called Teradata. And the name there was intended to convey these unimaginably large amounts of data that were out there in the world now. So they picked some science fiction suffix, tera, and that worked actually for more than a couple decades, and then that stopped being impressive enough. In 2008, came across an article about the coming petabyte age. And this is going back to the prefixes that you learned in grade school and then pretty quickly forgot. So petabytes serve to convey this crazy amount of data only for about 3 years. And then in 2011, Wired in the UK talked about the exabyte revolution. So we're getting some prefix creep here fairly quickly. That didn't last very long at all. Just in 2012, we got a report from Cisco about the zettabyte era. I have some bad news. I don't want to alarm anybody here, but we are in fairly serious danger of running out of metric system. The last time, there's evidently a metric system steering committee. The last time they got together was in 1991, and they brought together, interstellar astronomers and extraordinarily high energy physicists and whatnot, and they basically said, what's the biggest number you could ever possibly need going forward? And they said, yeah, we can't imagine a universe in which we need anything one beyond zeta. Yada is the only prefix we have left. After which we are going to run out of authorized ways to describe the volumes of data being created in the world. So there's been kind of an ad hoc committee formed to talk about what happens next. The leading candidate, I think, is Hella for describing what's going to happen next in the big data world. So there's just an obscene amount of data out there, and more being created all the time. The 3 V's that we hear about are accurate. The volume, variety, and yeah, all that's going on. So you can get a laugh out of a crowd of suits, not just a crowd of MIT people, but a crowd of pure suits. You'll get a laugh with this kind of story. Then they say, okay, great. So what? Why do we care? What's the business value? What's the business impact of these ridiculous volumes of data that are out there? So what I want to do is just give you a couple quick, just anecdotes, case studies, data point about the different kinds of impact that big data is already having and only going to have more as we move deeper into the hellabyte era here. So let me throw a couple of case studies at you. I think I spent so much time at Harvard Business School that I can't walk away from the idea of case studies as a good way to understand unfolding phenomenon. So let me try to give you a couple of them. The data scientists that Jeremy corrals and brings together at Kaggle are a really interesting crowd. They happen not to be a terribly modest or unambitious crowd. They think that they've got the new keys to the kingdom. I actually think they're probably right. My favorite data scientist quote is from someone who looked around and said, you know what, the world is one big data problem. We're kind of unconcerned about the domain, the particular challenge, the industry. Just give us the data and watch us do our work. And the more I look around, the more I think that there is more than a grain of truth to this view of the world. Let me give you 3 fairly quick examples. And 2 of them are going to be from domains far away from Silicon Valley and high tech, and in what I would call the mainline economy, the boring old economy, still being transformed by big data fairly quickly. We came across a really interesting company when we were writing the article named Passer Aerospace. Any of us heard of them? Right? Not super well known, but they are fairly big in the aviation industry. If you run an airline or you run an airport, you've probably done some business with Passer. They're pretty deep in here. And they noticed that the way we were making important decisions and predictions in the aviation industry wasn't working terribly well. How many of us have hopped on a plane, or how many of us have been in an airport in the past month? Keep your hand in the air if it was a lovely experience for you. Yeah, air travel is a really frustrating experience for all kinds of reasons. One of them is that we have all these little kind of micro to mini delays that add up and really frustrate us. It's sometimes hard to believe, but the airlines and airports don't inflict them on us for their sadistic pleasure. They don't like them either. And to give an example, if a plane is 5 or 10 minutes early getting to the ground, we all sit there on the plane and get frustrated. If the plane is 5 or 10 minutes late, the ground crew sits there wasting time and money waiting for us to show up. So these mini delays are really bad news for everyone involved in the industry. And what you would love is a truly accurate prediction about when the plane is going to land on the ground at the airport. It turns out the way that has historically been done is that the ground radios the pilot during the final approach of the plane and says, hey, Andy, when do you think you're going to be wheels down on the ground? And I imagine the most common response to that is something like, I'm kind of busy right now landing this damn plane. So I don't know, 6:17, I'll be on the ground. In other words, they literally ask the pilot for his or her best guess about what's going to happen. And that's not a terrible way to go. They are asking a person in a very good position to know, a knowledgeable person, a well-trained person, a person with a lot of experience built up over time. It turns out, though, that you still are inaccurate a lot about these guesses. Not half hour off, but 5 or 10 minutes, and that gets old and adds up and is frustrating for everybody. So Passer said, wait a minute, this is actually a big data problem, and we have one of the main sources of big data that you would need to solve it. In particular, we have this array of radar stations outside most of the big civil airports in the country, and we ping the sky every 5 seconds and get a picture of what's up there. We've got this massive body of data as a result. Why don't we combine that with weather data, with congestion data, with everything else that we can think of? We're going to throw it in this big data soup, and we're going to apply some predictive analytics on top of that massive data. And we're going to essentially say, the last time the world looks like this, when did the plane actually land? And we're going to do our prediction that way. We're going to hand it off from this pilot-based human method of prediction to an entirely algorithmic one. And this is essentially what happened as a result. This is a study one airline did about delays at their inaccuracies in the prediction at their airport, 5 and 10 minutes, before and after they switched over to this big data-driven approach for making this prediction. And what you see is that the variation just basically vanished. If you have enough data and enough history and enough smart people in the background, you get a better answer about what's going to happen here. I'm going to bring up Jeremy's company once again because I'm just so blown away by what they do over and over. They help large enterprises in doesn't matter which industry do better at some of the core elements of their business. And as Jeremy said in our panel earlier, it is bizarre. It continues to astonish me how much better you can do even than the alleged experts, the long-standing experts in their home domain. Yep. Uh-oh. Okay, to amplify that, our old buddies at Paso are now 36% less accurate than some random geek out there in the crowd. Is that about the right way to say it? Great, so you see how quickly things are turning over here. Let me talk about the power of the random geeks out there in the crowd. This is an older example that I learned from Jeremy before he had time to update me and kneecap my presentation here this afternoon. Thanks very much. Here's an older example. Allstate for a while back was a forward-thinking enough company and an interested enough company in this phenomenon to expose their data and expose their problem to the world's assembled data scientists. And so they gave the Kaggle data crowd a large data set about cars and essentially said, can you predict which of these cars is going to get into an accident, have a bodily liability claim filed against it? Now, this is kind of what Allstate's supposed to do for a living. It's really important for them to do this well. Sets their policies, lets them make money instead of give money away in payments. So this is the heart of Allstate's business. Allstate has been around for a while. I would have bet money that they were, if not the best in the world at this, they were at least pretty close to the frontier of predicting which cars are going to get into an accident. They ran a competition at Kaggle for about 12 weeks, and this is what they learned. Every time the color changes here, the lead changes in the competition. It turns out that data scientists love besting each other. They love to compete. If you upload a marginally better solution, I go back to work. And I strive to be the top line on that graph. We do see it tails off after a while. We do hit some kind of asymptote, but it's an asymptote that is about 340% better than the starting point. And if I remember right, Jeremy, about 270% better than Allstate's prediction their best prediction when they uploaded the data. So again, these are not marginal improvements. These are pretty big improvements, and they are not improvements in trivial peripheral parts of the business. When you expose your problems to your core problems, your core challenges, to the data geeks of the world, and you are kind of humble enough to do that, this is the magnitude of benefit that you see over and over again. One last quick case study, and I am going to put this picture up just because it was so dang cool to be in that car. The reason Eric and I are grinning like idiots here is that we survived a trip down Highway 101 in a car that didn't have any driver. And when the Google engineer hit the big red button on the dashboard of the car and switched it over to autonomous driving, there was a really interesting three-stage process that happened. And it felt like the three stages of whatever stages of grief. These are the three stages of autonomous driving. They unfolded very quickly. The first stage was abject terror. Because you're on the 101, you're going down the highway at speed, and there's nobody driving the damn car. And my initial thought was that the car would just start to veer into one lane, just like if you took your hands off it. That didn't happen. And so stage 2 kicked in about 30 seconds, which was just passionate interest in this phenomenon. You look out the window, you're like, nobody's driving the car, and you try to get people to pay attention to it. And you're just deeply bought into this thing, this autonomous driving. And that lasted for maybe 5 minutes, and then stage 3 kicked in, which was mild boredom about what was going on because the car was such an unexceptionally safe and good driver. It drove the way that we're all taught to in driver's ed and then immediately forget about. It went down the lane, stayed in the middle, went 55, maybe 56 if it was getting nutty, miles an hour, and it was the safest experience we've ever had. So we jumped out of the car and just thought, why on earth are we incredibly, distracted, on alert human beings driving cars anymore? But while we were in stage 3, while we were dealing with our mild boredom about autonomous driving, we started to pepper the Google engineers with questions. One of them had a laptop that showed what the car saw. It was kind of a video game representation of what the car saw. And it was like a video game. You just going down the street, there are all these rectangles going down the street with you. And she said, all those big rectangles are all the other cars that we're aware of on the road. And we counted, and they matched up with all the cars on the road, so that was good news. And she said, do you see those little rectangles next to each of the car rectangles? We said, yeah. She said, that's our best guess about where the blind spot is for every other car on the road. We've programmed our car to try very hard not to drive in anybody else's blind spot. How many of us really try hard to do that when we're driving? Right. These are the folk who have been in an accident, so they know. But I'm sure I got told that in driver's ed. I'm totally blithe when I drive down the road. The Google car is hyper alert, hyper vigilant, driving down the road, leads to this kind of nice anesthetized sense of boredom among people who are riding in it, all attest. This is a big data triumph. Google has mapped the roads, they've driven specialized cars, they've got Street View, they've got map data, they've got real-time sensors. All of these things, all of these pieces of hardware that help the car are getting cheaper along a Moore's Law trajectory. So this is not NASA budget kind of. Remember back when NASA had a budget? I should probably use a different example. This is not crazy budget to make this happen. This car is getting cheaper over time. And when you look around, it's remarkable how quickly different elements of autonomous driving are getting into production vehicles. The Google team tells us that if they haven't put completely autonomous vehicles on the road by 2020, they'll consider their work a large-scale failure. My lovely quote here comes from Peter Norvig, who's one of the senior AI researchers and spends a great deal of time at Google. He's got kind of a provocative quote. He says, we don't have better algorithms than you. We just have more data. We just sit on ridiculous volumes of data that let us do things like drive cars down the road with no driver. I think he's being a touch modest. They have really good algorithms, but driving a car autonomously, like so many other things in the world, is a big data problem here. I want to talk about just what I think are a couple of the profound implications for running and managing a company in a really big data world. The first one, and the change in the business world that I am most hopeful about, the one that I desperately hope happens, is that hippos become an endangered species. HIPPO is my new favorite business acronym. How many of us have heard it before? I guarantee you're going to use it and steal it from now on, please do. HIPPO stands for Highest Paid Person's Opinion. And it's how so many business decisions get made. You bring whatever question, whatever analysis you have to the HIPPO, and they look at it and they say, I will reflect on this and come back with my HIPPO answer to the question, and it shall be a good answer. The best fictional HIPPO these days is Don Draper from the TV series Mad Men. He's just got this kind of oracular vision of what the market is going to want, what's going to work next. And sometimes hippos are okay, sometimes they're not. They got to their position by virtue of having made a couple correct calls in the past, or having a glittering education, or a lovely resume, or whatever, but they arrived at this point where they get to make the tough calls. And they typically are doing a lousy job when you compare the outcome of hippo-based decisions against geek-based decisions. And by geek, I mean someone who gets out of the way, lets the data speak, follows the data, doesn't try to second guess or massage the data too much. When you adopt that geek-flavored, data-driven approach, it's not even a fair competition. The geeks just mop the floor with the hippos in domain after domain. There's been pretty good summaries of this research. There have been about 136 head-to-head comparisons of hippo predictions and decisions and judgments and diagnoses versus data-flavored ones, versus algorithmic ones. I think the hippos have come out ahead, and it's either 8 or 9 of them come out clearly ahead. That's a batting average that none of us would want out there playing the game. So we see this unfolding in a bunch of different domains. Moneyball, the science of being analytic about sports, has transformed the way baseball players are selected and evaluated. And if you're still relying on your old hippo scouts, the guys that know baseball talent when they see it, you are so far behind the leading edge that you're not winning very many baseball games up at the MLB level. We saw an incredibly clear example of the difference between hippos and geeks unfold during the 2012 election when Nate Silver and a couple of other people were letting the data speak about what the result of the presidential election was going to be. And they said all throughout the election season, the data are clear, they're consistent, they're not changing very much, and they point to an electoral victory for Obama of about 332 votes as best we can tell. There was actually another guy beyond Nate Silver who ran a website called instapundit.com, I believe it was, who in his very first prediction said Obama will get 332 electoral votes. He said it in June. Now, those geeks got drugged through the mud all throughout the election season by the hippos, by the pundits, by the oracles, by the people who had spent their lives in the trenches of politics working on campaigns and analyzing stuff, and the people needed to get their heads out of the spreadsheets and go look out there in the real world, and they would get a very different sense of the election because all the momentum was going the other way, and you got sick and tired of hearing this. And the geeks were vindicated just to an astonishing degree on election day. So in domain after domain, the hippos are, I hope, going to become an endangered species. Now, not on cable news, because they've got to fill up 24 hours a day, and pundits are a way to do that. But when the outcomes actually matter, when your decisions and your predictions actually matter, the head-to-head competition between the hippo and the geek is an unfair competition. The geek is going to win. And my greatest hope for the business world going forward is that realization is going to sink in more and more domains, and we're going to reduce the market share of hippos. Another pretty important implication, as we've heard a couple of times today, is the idea of a domain expert should shift. I hope it'll shift deeply. Shout it out. Who's this gentleman? I love MIT, right? Just, duh. So here's Richard Feynman, who's just one of the giants, one of the great intellects of the 20th century. And in addition to all the other things the guy did, a great MIT graduate, in addition to all the other things the guy did, he gave what I think is the best distillation of what science is and the scientific method that you'll ever come across. You can just read endless books and explanations of the scientific method. You don't need to go any further than a speech Feynman gave to students in 1964. And he explained how science worked. And he said, here's step number 1, you make a guess. And the students started laughing. He said, no, I'm not kidding. That's actually what you do. You make some kind of hypothesis. It's a guess about how you think the world works. And then the job of a scientist, the job of a geek, is to compare that guess to nature, to go get data, to go run an experiment, to go conduct some analysis. And here's the key to science. If your guess disagrees with what nature is telling you, if your guess disagrees with the data, it is wrong. And it doesn't matter how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't matter what your name is. It doesn't matter your level of prestige or your level of hippodom. All you need to know is if you are disagreeing with the data, you're wrong. And the correct attitude is to get the heck out of the way and listen to what the data are telling you. I want to wind up with one final quote this evening, and it comes from, I don't believe he was an MIT graduate. Voltaire, I think, was around before the Institute was, but he nailed it as well. The big data world that I hope we're heading into is one where we're going to judge a person a great deal more by their questions than by their answers. I was on the phone with the CEO of Password a while back, and he was talking about this big data approach to most things in the aviation industry, and I thought he was going to buy or employ an army of geeks to go solve all the problems out there. And then he said something really interesting. He said, and what we're desperately trying to do is go around to all the airports in the country and hire the most experienced operations people there. Hire the guy who's got 25 years on the ground at SFO or O'Hare or Logan. And I said, back up. That person is almost guaranteed not to be a geek. They're going to have all these biases. They're not going to know how to do the right kind of analysis. Why on earth would you want to go employ those people? He said, you don't get it. Those people know the problems that need to be solved in these different airports. There's no one who knows how to make SFO work better than someone who spent, or what problems need to be solved to make SFO work better than someone who spent years walking around that place. We want that person because they know what question to ask. My job as someone running a company is to combine that good question asker with a team, a very geek-flavored team of people who know how to go look in the data and get answers to those questions. That's how we're going to make our company run better. That's how we're going to make our industry run better. So finding the proper division of labor between the old-fashioned experts, hopefully the people who know which questions to ask, and the newfangled expertise of how to get the answers out of the data is going to be one of the great keys to competitive advantage in the world that we are very rapidly creating. I'm going to stop there. We have time, I think, for one question before wrap-up/cocktail hour. I can't think of a better way to incite a short question than to put it that way. All right, sir, this has to be bang-up, final, quick question. No pressure.
Son, take this back to the beginning. How is big data going to solve our unemployment and economic problems?
I'm not sure that it is. And I see that we're just about out of time.